Hello from London, where this week I'm snowed in. I can't get to the studio. But don't fear, there's still plenty to talk about this week on today's show. Firstly, the great vaccine rollout. More phenomenal figures on vaccination. But once the high risk are immunised, who should be next? The Brexit withdrawal deal already in tatters. The government accused of abandoning Northern Ireland and being urged to take strong action to protect the union. And most importantly, of course, when is a pub not a pub? Well, when it can't sell alcohol, of course. And why is that? Still no roadmap out of lockdown. All that and much more coming up on today's TICE Talk. Hello again and welcome to my weekly show, TICE Talk. And what a week it's been. The second beast from the east has visited with a vengeance. Storm Darcy dragging freezing cold air from Scandinavia, from Russia, over to the UK. And this time it's the east and the southeast that have been particularly hard hit, with snow causing major travel disruptions, strong winds, huge snowdrifts, and many power outages.
In both directions because of the snow.
And all of this means that I've been snowed in. I can't make it to the studio, but keeping my seat warm is my friend and great colleague, David Bull. How are you, David?
I'm very well indeed, thank you, Richard. Well, as you can see, I have made it here, but also, as you can see, it is incredibly snowy. We've had tons of snow. We've also had incredible winds, and that's caused massive snowdrifts. And I have to say a very big thank you to all the farmers who've worked tirelessly round the clock, clearing the roads to make sure that the emergency services can get through and the food deliveries and so on. Now, my story of the week also involves farmers, because farmers have had a really tough time in the COVID lockdown, and many of them are really struggling for income. So one very enterprising farmer called Dot McCarthy, who runs a farm called Crookshank Fold Farm, came up with a fantastic idea. So she has a lot of goats, and she decided that to brighten up Zoom conversations, and everyone hates those, she was going to offer her goats to anyone who wanted to invite one onto a Zoom meeting. So it was a bit of a crazy idea. She put it online, she went to bed, and when she woke up the next morning, she had 200 emails from people saying, yes, they would actually like to have one of her goats. So the goats literally butt in to a business meeting, a very enterprising idea. But not only that, Dot has now made £50,000 from this venture, and the goats have become incredibly famous indeed. They've appeared in China, in Australia, and even in Russia. So I say all power to the farmers.
Thank you, David. All power to the farmers and the goat. Well, news-wise, it's been a little calmer this week. We've had the good, the bad, and yes, a little degree of humour, a bit of fun. So let's review it all here on What's News. So David, let's start with the good news, the really good news. Please give us an update on where we are with the vaccine programme, the progress and the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, Richard, the scale of the vaccination programme is really quite extraordinary. Something like 12.5 million people have now had their first vaccination, and something like 500,000 people have had their second. And it looks like the government is on target to meet its own target of February the 15th to make sure that the most vulnerable people have been immunised. And really, it's an extraordinary effort. I have to say, on a very personal level, I took my mum to have her first immunisation in one of these pop-up clinics that have appeared in a sports hall. I have to tell you, the staff were amazing, so kind, and just in terms of the way that it was carried out, you know, it was incredibly well organised. The fact is, we didn't have to wait a very long time, just the warmth and love and care, and it just shows how everyone's come together. And I just want to say a very big thank you to everyone who worked there.
Well, that's quite right, and I endorse that too. But then, of course, you've got all the good news, but then the government's acting a bit like a yo-yo at the moment, where all of a sudden, the next breath, it's scaring us with chat about variants from different countries and counties, What's going on here? What's your sense of it? What's the latest?
Well, I'm not sure it's the government necessarily scaring us, but I think the newspapers are doing a jolly good job. Look, the point is that we've got two vaccines at the moment that we're using, the Pfizer-BioNTech and the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine. And the thing is, those vaccines have been developed to deal with the variants that we are seeing in the UK. The most dangerous variant that we are now seeing in the UK is the Kent variant. It's 30% more deadly, and it's about 40 to 70% more infectious. Now, the really good news is the Oxford AstraZeneca and the Pfizer-BioNTech both protect against that particular variant, about 74% effectiveness against that. But the whole point about this, the one that we're worried about, is the South African variant. We're not seeing a great deal of it yet in the UK, but there is some of it. But there is some also cheering news, which is that the current vaccines being in the UK do actually protect against death and serious illness from that variant. So the message from government is, if you are invited to have a vaccine, have a vaccine. Do not wait for any other vaccines to come online.
And that's great. But you say that, the sort of the worrying one is the South African one. But I think, again, the government needs to show some leadership and explain and educate to all of us that, just like the flu vaccine, actually, this vaccine will be tweaked. Viruses, they mutate, they vary. It's what they do. They always have, they always will. And I think we've just got to get used to this rather than be scared about it. Well,
I think that's right.
Vaccines,
it's something
vaccines
that we
are
have
safe.
to...
I mean, talk to us about the numbers, David, of the safety of jabs.
Yeah, to your first point, Richard, yes, it's something that we have to learn to live with. In terms of safety, it's as safe as the flu jab. They actually took a sample size of about 1.5 million people and looked at how many of those got adverse side effects, and it was really low. It was about 6,000. And we're really talking about very minor side effects, so things like a sore arm, a bit of a temperature. But in terms of those variants that we were talking about earlier, the government really is ahead of the curve. And very interesting, there's something else I should have just said. The fact that we're now waiting 12 weeks for the second immunisation now turns out to be very good science. The government did it on a hunch, but actually the science is now backing that up. And the government's invested heavily in a company to actually change the vaccine so that it responds to the new variants. So actually, I think the vaccination policy in this country is going incredibly well. And you can see from our friends in the European Union, they're not terribly happy because theirs isn't going quite so well.
Surprise, surprise. Well, that's great, David, and thanks for that. But of course, there is some bad news. I've called the government a bit like a yo-yo. There's the upside, there's the downside, and the real downside is there's no concrete news on schools reopening. And it seems to me the government is oblivious to the pain that's being caused to young children, their relations with their siblings, with their parents, parents with parents. There's real damage, mental health issues involved here. And we used to have a thing called a Secretary of State for Education, but that person's been missing in action for so long, we've forgotten his name, let alone what he looks like. I mean, the only thing we do remember is we think it is a male at the moment. One school I know has basically taken matters into their own hands. Uppingham, they've decided they're going to close this term a week early because they don't think they'll be able to reopen online. And they're going to start the summer term also a week early because they expect that'll actually gain them an extra week back in the classroom. And to me, to be honest, that seems really smart thinking. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, it's absolutely paramount that children go back to school. Children can't remember what normal life is like. This is absolutely ridiculous. And the fact is, actually, children are missing out not just on teaching, formal teaching at school, but the social interaction with other children. They need to learn their place in society. They need to learn how people interact together. And crucially, once we get children back, then parents can go back to work. And once parents go back to work, the economy starts to grow again. And, I think what we do need very, very much now is a roadmap out of lockdown. In terms of children's education, though, I do think that their schools are going to have to rethink. I think the days should be longer. The children are so desperate to get back to school, they will learn. And I think we need longer terms, because there is a very real fear that there will be a whole generation of children that just misses out entirely.
Yeah, it's just not acceptable. Well, we need to move to, obviously, to the second big story of the week. And I think this will be ongoing. And this is, of course, with our friends, the European Commission, and the ongoing saga of, the paperwork, the bureaucracy, which always drives me mad. The bureaucracy across the RSC for goods moving between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain under what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I mean, it's outrageous, isn't it, David?
It is outrageous. We talked about this a great deal when we were Brexit Party MEPs, and we warned the government, we warned the Prime Minister that actually the withdrawal agreement was problematic, because what they essentially did, they left Northern Ireland in the customs union and in the single market, and therefore have put a sort of dividing line in the Irish Sea. Now, the problem with that is that we've already seen the EU, with the lack of the COVID vaccine, triggering Article 16, essentially saying, hang on a minute, you can't have vaccines into Northern Ireland, which was a very, very dangerous move, because now the DUP is very worried that Northern Ireland is being annexed by the very body that said it was going to protect it. And of course, this is really problematic going forward, because what it shows is actually the Northern Ireland Protocol doesn't work, and there are a lot of people who are very angry about this. There's a petition that's been launched online, and over 100,000 people have signed it, because they are determined that the Northern Ireland Protocol needs to be re-looked at, renegotiated and changed.
Well, you're absolutely right. I'm one of the people who signed that petition. I agree with Arlene entirely. As you say, this was totally predictable. We warned about it. And essentially, we are potentially in a trade war situation. It's not good enough for the government to say, we just need to extend a few issues. This is really serious. The whole fishing industry is under threat, in particular shellfish, where the EU seems to have sort of banned shellfish. And I think the government needs to respond. We've got the moral high ground. I think they need to be absolutely robust and to make it clear that, give them maybe a week's notice maximum. Otherwise, we're going to stop all German cars coming in, all French wine coming in, all other EU boats fishing in our waters, unless this is sorted out once and for all. And if they want a trade war, frankly, then that's what they're going to end up with. It is totally unacceptable. And, we shouldn't be wet and feeble about this. But any thoughts on that, David? You agree?
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I think the EU... No, the EU was very stupid to trigger Article 16, because actually we have a lot of moral high ground, I think. And actually the UK now has a very strong hand. And I'm nervous the Prime Minister throws that away, because actually, if the EU is behaving badly, which is essentially what it is doing, then we need to look very hard at what we allow the European Union to do, say, for example, in our fishing waters. So at the moment, we are actually looking at licensing the 6 to 12 mile radius around the United Kingdom. Well, guess what? Let's slow it down. Let's not license it to European boats, because if they do something, we can retaliate. Now, the fact is, we need to work together. We need to be friends and partners. But the EU also needs to understand we are a free, independent, self-governing country, and therefore we are entitled to do our own trade deals, to go our own way, and the EU needs to get used to it.
That's right. They think they've got the upper hand. We mustn't let ourselves be rolled over. And if that means, for example, on fishing, that we furlough some of the fishermen, the government could start buying lots of the shellfish and other fish that our fishermen can't sell into the EU. We used to have things like sort of wheat mountains and butter mountains. Well, we can create we can freeze a lot of fish. We can use it later on. We have to show the EU that we really mean business. Well, in better news, indeed amusing, the EU Commission President, none other than Ursula von der Leyen, she admitted this week that, yes, the UK can act like a speedboat as a single country, whilst the EU is a slow, lumbering tanker when it's acting for 27 countries. I thought that was quite amusing. Now, David, what other good news have you got for us?
Well, the very good news is pubs, because we're all so desperate to go to the pub for a drink. However, it's not quite as good as that, because the government did indicate that if we are good and if we're well behaved, then the pubs may open in April. But here's the downer: they're not allowed to serve alcohol. Now, I don't really understand the reason for that. Apparently, though, it's because when people drink, they don't maintain social distancing. But at least they got rid of that ridiculous rule about having a substantial meal, which means that you needed a pork pie to have 3 pints of lager. But look, this is ridiculous. We need to trust people. We need pubs to open. We need small economies to grow again, villages to reopen. This nonsense has got to stop. It's about trust.
I mean, how can you have a pub if you haven't got alcohol? It's a complete contradiction in terms. All you'll end up with is, what we had in America, whenever it was, 80, 90 years ago. You ended up with prohibition and booze in brown bags. And, I've got here, the modern version of that will be some form of chili bottle, and you'll pretend that it's water or a soft drink, and actually it's full of a delicious, gin martini. I know you like those, David. I mean, it's just a nonsense. We've got to try and, try and get life back to normal and trust people, for heaven's sake.
Yeah, absolutely right. It sounds like my student days when we used to fill up water bottles with very strong spirits.
Well, that's great stuff, David. Entertaining. So coming up, we're going to have a healthy conversation about how to build reserve capacity in the NHS to ensure that there really is never again another national lockdown, a fourth lockdown. And we'll be chatting to a former retired nurse, now an elected politician. But for now, it's time for The Forgotten. Well, here on the Forgotten section of the show, we talk to people and groups who've been completely abandoned and ignored by the government under lockdown. And a couple of months ago, I actually launched the campaign to stop the student rip-off. And I felt it was incredibly unjust that students were being charged full fees for what's essentially become online courses with little or no physical lectures, no social interaction with other students. And in some cases, students are being sort of literally incarcerated, fenced off from the outside world. And we're demanding that students are given 30% off their fees and rent for this year. And here to tell her story, her experiences, we've got Dominique Samuels, a student at the University of York. Dominique is studying politics and international relations. Dominique, great to have you with us. Thank you very much, for sharing your time and your thoughts. What sort of student experience are you receiving? And what are the restrictions like? And how do you feel you're being treated by your university and from what you're hearing elsewhere?
Well, to be frank, I feel like my year has essentially been robbed from me because it's been, a very uncertain time. A lot of students have booked student accommodation, spent a lot of money on it on the basis that they were returning to university to receive relatively the same experience. That's just not been the case. I personally have spent thousands of pounds on rent in York and haven't actually been able to use the accommodation because obviously we're in lockdown and I'm not there. So I think that is a big stress for me and also a lot of students who are having to still pay for things that they can't actually use. In terms of the restrictions, the biggest way that a lot of students can let off steam, myself included, is being able to go out to bars, being able to go out to restaurants, and essentially being able to use the student facilities and socialise with other students, right? And the fact of the matter is, right now, we're actually not able to do that because nothing's open. None of the student facilities are really open for students to use. So that in itself, combined with the fact that basically everything online is extremely stressful. A lot of students have gone through depression. I myself, my anxiety levels have increased so much because I have so much work to do, yet I just simply don't have the same level of motivation. And all in all, I just feel as though, we're not getting the service that we paid for, and not a lot of people and not enough people are talking about ways to rectify this situation and reimburse students.
I mean, that's fascinating. So you just touched on there about, the impact on your mental health, how friends are struggling. Is there any support that you're receiving from the universities, for people that are struggling with lockdown? Do you think universities understand what's going on?
I think, I will be fair, I feel like universities have made some steps, particularly with mine. But, a lot of people just don't feel like it's good enough. Universities have received funding from the government, yet we don't feel as though we're directly seeing the effects of that. Mental health is extremely important, and students, have had to demand for better student mental health support and better, communication from our university. But at the same time, receiving emails and having to wait days for a response just really isn't the same level of communication and support that we would have received in normal kind of circumstances. And we were told that universities were going to try and make circumstances as normal as possible. And that just hasn't materialised. For York, there's a COVID emergency fund for students that have been financially affected by COVID. And that's great. But because it's an applications process, obviously not all students will be able to access that money. And I know people that have applied who actually are in hardship and have been rejected. So not all students can receive that same level of support.
No, I mean, I get that. And what's been the quality of the online learning compared to what you would normally receive face to face? Do you feel that the quality's been good enough, or has it let you down? And is that part of essentially how you're just not getting value for money, how you're being ripped off?
I think that, lecturers, are trying as hard as they can. Not all of them are bad. Specifically, my ones that I have for my modules, I think they're making a great effort. But the fact of the matter is, online learning is incomparable and, just not the same as face-to-face teaching. That's just a fact. It's harder to retain the information, and it's harder to actually have that level of debate and discussion that, we're usually able to have when we're face-to-face with our lecturers and able to engage in that learning more. And I know for a lot of people, they just don't feel like that quality of service is there. I have a friend who actually studies chemistry, and because he's at home, he doesn't have the software that he needs to be able to do his work. And, that's just one of many examples of the way it's just not the same having to do everything online.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm not sure the government has any idea, what this really means for students. And are you hearing any form of discussion about timing to go back to face-to-face lectures and tutorials? Any form of roadmap being given to students from the university? Are you talking weeks or months?
Well, we have heard some kind of dates of when we'll be back for face-to-face teaching, and one of them is in the summer. And it's great that we have some kind of time frame of when we're actually going to get a proper, and rigorous education. However, the fact of the matter is, for most of the year, students haven't received the service that they've actually paid for. So surely it's common sense to discuss some level of discount or reimbursement for students with their tuition fees, because we just haven't received the same level of service, surely. And I think the government has only recently actually started to discuss this, and they've paid lip service to it, but, students haven't received nearly this, anywhere near the same level of support that businesses have received throughout this pandemic. So whilst I think that, the noise that the government is making with regards to this is a step in the right direction, I think there needs to be, some tangible and real effort made by the government to try and address this.
No question at all. And the sooner the better. Sadly, there's been far too little common sense applied to so many different sectors who've been forgotten. Well, look, Dominique, thank you so much for those thoughts. It's really, really helpful to hear that. I know that our viewers will really appreciate that. And there's no question that students should be given some compensation for the dramatic substandard service that has been received this year. Thanks again, Dominique, and I wish you all the best, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you for having me.
Well, some fascinating thoughts there from Dominique. And I have another extraordinary story that I heard from Leeds University, where 8 students living in a student house, minding their own business one evening, playing a little bit of music. And thanks to the encouragement that cabinet ministers like Priti Patel and others, that people should spy and snitch on their neighbours and near neighbours, all of a sudden, 12:30 at night, 4 coppers pile into this student house thinking that there's a massive rave going on. There wasn't at all. There was literally just a bit of music. But that's the world we now live in. And I think it's really, really shocking. Police careering through a house, knocking on doors of students and asking them to get dressed, come downstairs, give their name and number. I mean, it's like a police state. It's utterly appalling. And this government may have forgotten about students amongst many others, but rest assured, on this show, on TICE Talk, they are not forgotten. Now, at this time of the show, we'd normally go to Evan, who would try and give a bit of lighten the mood a bit with an uplifting story for Evan's sake, but he's been snowbound. So we can't do that this week, and we're going to head straight into the TICE report. The NHS is probably the most loved healthcare system in the world, for it's free at the point of delivery, which is, of course, fantastic. But we have to be honest. We have to admit that it's probably not the best managed, nor the most efficient healthcare system in the world. It's enormous. It's the 3rd largest employer in the world, behind the Indian railway system and the Chinese army. And we have to welcome a culture of continuous improvement. And of course, it is going to need more funding. And last week we showed how far behind it is compared to other nations. But we have to be smart with how we spend new money. And the NHS leaders and managers must accept that with additional funding comes reform. 2 weeks ago, we touched on how to build capacity in the system and how we build in some contingency to deal with future crises. And one of the biggest obstacles, challenges to reform is the level of staffing that would be required to run extra beds, extra wards, and the Nightingale hospitals that would basically taken down. So how do we rebuild them? And crucially, how do we staff them?
Well, they're very good questions indeed, Richard. So to discuss all this and more, I'm delighted that we have an expert on hand, our very own former nurse, Michelle Ballantyne, MSP, leader for Reform UK Scotland. Michelle, it is really good to see you. Now, I know that both of us have talked a great deal about increasing NHS staff capacity. And actually, last week, Richard and I talked in detail about having this idea of an NHS Reserve Force, a little bit like the Territorial Army for former and retired medics, doctors and nurses. So firstly, what do you think of that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. It really is the only way forward. And it's something I've also talked about, as an ex-forces family and as a nurse, as you say, and somebody who used to manage services. The idea of being able to pick up the phone and have a ready force out there who can come in at a moment's notice, it would completely change the problems we have when we come under pressure. And it's something that not just for the pandemic, but for every single winter that we could use. Mm-hmm.
I mean, as a former or retired doctor, I've actually got my license to practice back. I'm very keen to help out. I know there are many thousands of doctors like me that are very keen to help out, but in this particular pandemic, they haven't asked us to do that yet. Just in terms of building this reserve force, what do you think would be needed? Because clearly we would need to make sure that people have some sort of training, that they are actually accredited. They would have to have some sort of a refresher. We'd need to license them. And do we need to pay them?
Well, yes. I mean, clearly it's not just as straightforward as saying you used to work here, come in. But what we can do is when you leave, just as you do in the forces, when you leave, you have a reserve commitment. Now, that doesn't always require you to come back in and do training. You can just turn up. But I think with the NHS, you'd want to look at the various grades of people. So when you leave, if you're a nurse, for example, you can have a reserve commitment to come in to help manage a ward and manage patients. And that can be as simple as making the beds, doing the routine observations, actually doing the bed baths, making sure people are toileted, all that kind of thing that needs doing and takes quite a lot of time and effort. And then you work up to say, a doctor who you want to retain, a specialist, and you can say, well, actually, we want to retain your skills as you retire or you leave. So we would like you to do, one weekend a month where we come in and we make sure you're up to date. And I think in terms of payment, we may have to offer some payment, but I think we can also ask for some commitment, because I think there are a lot of people out there who actually would be quite happy to actually do something and give something back. I'm the sort of person that would have quite happily done my, 1 day a month just to keep my hand in and make sure that in an emergency I could go in. But the Reserve Force for the Armed Forces absolutely does that. You get paid for your training time that you go in and do. And then if you get called up, you get paid for the time that you are called up for. And I see no reason why we couldn't replicate that for the NHS.
I totally agree. I actually think this would be incredibly positive. It would sort of grow affiliation with the NHS. We hold the NHS very dear to our hearts. And actually, I think it would become very much part of our culture. And crucially, we'd also build up that supply of first responders as well, which we know we need.
Yeah. And I think it also gives a confidence to people and gives much more of a buy-in to how the NHS works. Because you could actually also train, you could have a larger reservist if you wanted, just of people who say, I'm willing to give my time. I mean, one of my sons, for example, served as a soldier in the Afghanistan conflict, and trained as a medic, for first aider for his unit. He's the sort of person who would say, actually, I would quite happily be an NHS reservist. And then if they needed somebody, and even to, move beds around or, help out. So I think there's a whole cohort of people who would give their time in the same way that they join the armed forces and give their time. So I think it's something that we could think about. And it's not just about when they go into hospital. You're absolutely right. It's actually making sure that we have this huge cohort of people who can help in an emergency if they come across one. They can be trained in a degree of first aid. They can be trained in a degree of even just securing an incident area. So there's lots of options there that could actually make a huge difference.
Let me just show you a graph very quickly, Michelle. This is a graph of hospital bed numbers. Now, as you can see, it declines very significantly in the last few years, and population has risen. But it's not quite as simple as that graph shows, because as you and I know, the actual length of stay in hospital has changed dramatically. So when I was a junior doctor, if you had a heart attack, you had to be in for 5 days. That doesn't happen anymore. So given the fact that hospital stay duration has halved probably, does that go all the way to explaining the reduction in bed numbers? Do we need to do something more?
Yeah, I mean, the relationship between bed numbers and population is clearly not a straightforward one. What we need to understand is weights. So we know if we haven't got enough beds, when we can't get people in when they should be coming in. But it is also about staff. And I think staff is probably more crucial than beds, because beds are simpler to create. There is obviously a financial cost to them, but you can create more beds if you really need them. What you can't create is immediate staff. And we are heading for a huge shortage in doctors. I mean, the numbers are just eye-watering as you look forward. So I think what we really need to do is revisit how we train our medics, the amount of time it takes to train a doctor, the way in which we retain our doctors. I mean, a lot of my friends who've trained in medicine have disappeared abroad to go to Australia or New Zealand or wherever. So we've got to make it an attractive prospect to work in the NHS. And we have to look after our people in a way which is not just about money. It is about working conditions. It is about the enjoyment of working. I'm speaking to an increasing number of nurses, particularly now, who are saying, I just can't do this anymore. I just feel so stressed. I don't feel I'm listened to. I feel it's got too much. So the pleasure of the vocation is disappearing. And I think that's something we really need to look at, because the only way we provide good care is to have good people who feel committed and able to work effectively.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Michelle.
Thank you.
Now, we're very keen to hear from people who have worked or are working in the NHS on how to build capacity and to hear where improvements can be made. Now, we can do any interview anonymously, we can disguise your voice, we can disguise your face, because still there is a culture of cover-up and people do feel scared to speak out publicly. There seems to be a real sense of intimidation stopping criticism of the service, which actually holds back improvements on the ground. And the really crucial thing is we need to build a culture of openness and not blame, and accept that mistakes do get made, but we do need to learn from them, and we need to learn from them fast. And we'll be returning to this subject in the future with Michelle and others.
Well, this is the time when we look at the comments, the emails, the tweets that people have been kindly sending to us, and please do keep them coming. There's far too many to read out, but there's some really good ones I just want to go through this week. Starting with one from Charlie, who says that his son is an assistant director of nursing at a large general hospital. He doesn't have a degree. He started as an auxiliary nurse at the age of 16, and he started truly dedicated, working long hours, 7 days a week sometimes. And, you know, he's now 42, so he's been working for over 2 decades. And so the question, quite rightly, is why do you need a degree to care for people? What was wrong with the original bursary scheme? And so Charlie's comment is, boy, does the NHS need reform? And I touched on that earlier. The second one is, the comment is from Darren. Darren said, surely it'd make a sense to have a more balanced approach to giving out the vaccine. What Darren was doing was referring to, people's livelihoods are disappearing. He's concerned that the rich are getting richer and the poor poorer. And actually, should we have more of those who need to get back out working to be vaccinated earlier? Look, I think this is a really difficult subject, but what is absolutely clear is that many people who are locked down, they haven't got the money to pay their bills, they can't work, and debt is building up. And, we really have got to get the working population, who can, back into work. And yes, the vaccination is great, but, we can't wait now that we've got effectively got the first 4 groups, the most vulnerable, vaccinated. And I think so many people are thinking about this, but many people are too scared to actually express it. And the next comment we had was from Nigel. It seems that every week, David, we get told of a little by some of our viewers, and this one said we're waving our hands out far too much, and just the occasional finger wagging, but not too much. And then amusingly said that common sense, well, remember that sense isn't very common. Well, that's what we stand for in reform, the application of common sense. There was some comments about our sartorial elegance or otherwise. What? Which was quite entertaining. I know. Quite. It says, no gentleman should wear a vest or pyjamas. If he feels for the latter, he should wear a nightshirt. I mean, I don't know where that came from anyway.
Hang on a minute. Can I just interject at this point? Can I just interject and explain that the reason that it wasn't a vest, it was a thermal vest. And the reason is this studio is so cold that otherwise my teeth would have been chattering so much I wouldn't have been able to speak.
There we are. A suitable explanation. Then we had another comment from David, who was talking about vaccine passports, and his view was no, we mustn't have vaccine passports. David, what's your thought on this? I think this is going to become a huge issue over the coming months. We're only just touching on it at the moment. What's your thoughts, David?
Yeah, I mean, I think being no doubt that these are going to come in, and they're going to come in probably by the airlines, possibly more than anyone else. I think the thing is the airline industry is on its knees. It's desperate to resume flying. And I think one of the only ways that the countries are going to let the airlines in is to say, well, you'll only be allowed to carry passengers who have proof that they have had a vaccine. Now, actually, for many countries, that's already a requirement. If you go to certain countries, you have to prove that you've had yellow fever vaccination, for example. So I think vaccine passports are coming, and quite frankly, I'm so desperate to go and lie on a beach in the sun, I'll carry one.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I also think that actually in the private sector, I think individual companies may decide that they want to ask for proof of vaccination. I could see, for example, people like cinemas, who obviously have had a terrible time. They've been shut for so long. They may say, well, if you want to come and watch a film, then, we need to see your passport. So I suspect that actually some of it won't be dictated by government. It may well be dictated by the private sector, private companies. Well, and in a sense, that's their choice.
Well, the problem with that, Richard, is that then you have to look at other things like the flu vaccine. So actually, if we can actually immunise the requisite number of people so that essentially we're protecting the most vulnerable, then there's no reason that you have to prove you've had a vaccine. Now, how would you feel, for example, if you tried to go to the cinema and they said, have you had a flu vaccine? It's the same argument, isn't it?
It is, but I think it's just such a learning curve. And I suspect some private companies, they may be tempted to go down that route, and it may be that there's resistance and maybe they respond to their consumers. I think you're right. I don't think it is any different to the flu vaccine, but it's all part of this process of learning to live with this virus, isn't it, David? People need to accept that it is like going forwards. It is going to be like having the flu vaccine. Whether you have it every year, every other year, we've just got to learn to live with this, and I think that's a process of understanding.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, we're going to see change in the vaccine every single year. The government's already secured a contract, a £50 million contract with a company that's going to change the vaccine every year as the virus itself changes. So we are going to have to box clever. The thing is, this is never going to be eradicated. It is now endemic in the United Kingdom. We have to learn to live with it. We have to open the economy, and we have to open our borders. And the thing is, we need life to return to normal.
Yeah, and that is the balance that the government is grappling with. I think many of us would rather that they give us some hope, some light at the end of the tunnel much sooner. It's going to be a big debating point over the coming weeks and months, and we will no doubt return to it. And before we finish, thank you, David, for that on those comments. Before we finish, we do like to give a particular thanks to an individual or a particular group, and please do put forward your thoughts on anybody who's gone beyond, above and beyond to help communities, to help the respective part of the public sector. And this week, actually, really, we have to say a massive thank you, huge appreciation to the vaccine army who have been helping in so many different ways, so that we truly have, on this occasion, literally become a world beater in our vaccination program, and that's because of the army of volunteers. So a massive thank you to everybody involved with that. I do have a feeling that we might be saying to you, same time, same place later this year to revaccinate everybody. But anyway, listen, that's all we've got time for. David, thank you so much for your input, your thoughts, your views. Any final sort of sign off from you?
No, Richard, I just hope that I get to see you next week. I hope the snow is melting. Actually, I can hear icicles dropping off the building as we speak. So I'm hoping that you'll be with me next week.
Well, let's hope so. And let's hope that people, viewers, send us your comments. And please do watch us next week. Join us for plenty more politics, alternative views, honest opinions. Thank you for watching. See you next time. And until then, stay safe and keep smiling.